we've also been very active in research into meditation and kind of bringing together science and spirituality. I guess I'm interested in your take on how those fit together, and also why you think it's important in this age to kind of offer a kind of a scientific defense of meditation.
I would not recommend that anyone get in a fight with science, because you're going to lose, most likely, eventually. At least that's the way things are looking now, based on what we can see of history. So why do you not want to get in a fight with science? Because science has the most sophisticated form of humility that I've encountered. And the only way to fight with that form of humility is to not have that form of humility yourself, to have a certain kind of arrogance. Now, there's lots of kinds of arrogance, and there's lots of kinds of humility. I said a certain kind of arrogance, talking about something specific. And you might have thought it's strange, because aren't the scientists the arrogant ones, and the people talking about religion and whatever, aren't they supposed to be the humble ones? Well, did I or did I not say there are various kinds of arrogance, various kinds of humility? But the way that scientists are humble, and the way that successful contemplative practitioners are humble, that's the same way. I know I haven't told you what it is yet. This is like a big build-up, I hope, to something useful. Successful contemplative practitioners base their worldview on the same form of humility that scientists do. They came to it in a very different way. Scientists came to it through discussion, argument, centuries of hashing shit out. Meditators come to it through a different mechanism. And because the languaging's different, you might not realize the deep underlying isomorphism. So isomorphism in mathematics refers to situations where things may seem to be completely different, yet there's a way of looking at them that makes them the same. That's called an isomorphism, from the obvious Greek roots. So what is this advanced form of humility that's shared by the contemplative tradition and the scientist, and is conspicuously absent in many other groups, at least upon occasion? Particularly the form of humility that I'm going to claim is an overlap between meditation and science. That form of humility is often conspicuously lacking in people that follow fundamentalist type religions. People that need to have a basis of authority in scripture, social organization, what have you, hierarchy of whatever. those kinds of people share a form of arrogance that you would normally call arrogance. So maybe I'm being a little harsh in my language, but to me, it's a form of arrogance, meaning they lack a form of humility. Now, all of this sounds very judgmental. I don't really mean it that way. It's just a classification of different kinds of fundamental views of things. So now all of that, I am aware, was completely abstract. What the hell is he talking about? Okay, so how it goes to the difference, if I had to put a word to it, and I was allowed to make up what words, not make up, but say, this is how I would call it. I would say that there's amun and amunah. These are two words in Hebrew, Aramaic. One means belief and the other one means faith. So belief is a fundamental stance that says, I need an answer. And I have found an answer. I've found a story, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Jesus said it. I believe it. That settles it. That can be quite good for people. It's not that that's a bad thing. That becomes a bad thing if it's combined with an intrinsic form of arrogance. It becomes a good thing if it's not. So what's the arrogance in this case? It's the insisting on the part of the human ego to have an answer that suits itself. I want a story that's a story that works for my ego. Now, if I can find that story that also helps me at the same time transcend my ego, then it could be an okay thing. But it's still the basis of everything being okay is latching onto a story that may not be a true story, may just be a myth, a very reasonable sounding story. Reasonable sounding because evolutionary forces molded it to be reasonably sounding. So belief is associated with what the form of human arrogance called, I've got to have a story that works for me. Faith is the practice of letting go of that need. And letting go of the assumption that you're going to find the answer and replacing that with the assumption we're going to make continuous improvements by letting go of less good answers. The continuous improvement by letting go of what doesn't work is the form of humility that underlies contemplative practice and science. Holding on to a story and saying my way or the highway can impart a kind of humility, but it also easily imparts a form of intellectual discussion that is intellectually unacceptable. And that's why science rejects this form of discussion. And the form of discussion goes like this. I'm a follower, you see this most clearly in people that follow religions. But you see it in wherever there's a fanatic. You know, you may have heard that, what was it in the Victorian period, in polite society, you wouldn't discuss religion or politics. Wasn't there something like that in the UK?
Yeah, it sounds very familiar.
I think I've heard that. So, well, there's a reason for that. The definition of a zealot or a fundamentalist is that they won't change their view and they won't change the conversation. It's like, we're going to talk until you either agree with me or I go somewhere else, because that's it. There's nothing more to talk about. That's an extreme of what happens if you if you follow a certain form of logic, a form of logic that is rejected by science. And the form of logic goes like this. The zealot is going to make some claim. Fossils, the fossil record is misinterpreted, and the biblical account of the world, 7,000 years, whatever, is the correct chronology. I know people that actually believe that. That's where this story is coming from. Jewish, in this case, not Christian, but, you know. And when he asked his sister, what about the dating process? There's 5,000 different angles this stuff has been approached from chemically, and it always leads to the same conclusion. That the rocks are much older than 7 days. And well, then the religious person says, no, God still made the world in 7 days. They just used 100 million billion year old rocks. So, okay, you sort of maneuver your way out of that. Now, you give another objection and something like, well, I can counter that because God, blah, blah, blah. And then you give another objection, I can counter that because God, blah, blah, blah. What it always goes back to is God can do anything. So that means I can say anything. Because I can give you a reason that anything is true. God can do it. In chess, you can't have the kings facing each other. That's a rule because it messes things up. You can't have a conversation where no matter what I say, you have a form of story that explains whatever you want. And it also will explain contradictions. Bring any contradiction. Well, God can do anything. God can transcend a contradiction. That kind of reasoning, magical thinking. Science saw through it through logic. Meditators see through it when they see through the self, when they let go of the stickiness around their own thoughts and emotions. It leads to that flavor of humility. I don't need an answer. I need to work through my drivenness to have answers. There's a fundamental intersection between the equanimity with don't know that is central in the liberation traditions and the various limiting results that science has shown, like in math, incompleteness principles, in physics, uncertainty principles, undecidability. Oh my God, most of math is undecidable. So there's all sorts of limitations. And what scientists do is say, fine, we don't know, we can't know, and we just move on. We're not trying to get the answer. We're trying to see through our mistakes via negativa. And from that perspective, there is a really unexpected overlap or commonality between the contemplative traditions and the scientific tradition, and makes them stand in contrast in some ways to, quote, religion.
And I know you've trained in multiple meditation kind of practices, but do you think mindfulness is particularly well suited for this parallel between kind of science and contemplation?
Well, it sort of depends on how you define mindfulness. That's a movable feast. People now at this point, mindfulness means whatever the hell someone wants it to mean. I mean, I meet people socially that ask me, what do I do? I say, I'm a mindfulness teacher. And they say, oh, I am too. I say, oh, that's great. What do you do? And then they describe to me something that is fairly far removed from what I would call mindfulness. So I think at this point, unfortunately, the word means whatever people say it means. For me, mindfulness is synonymous with meditation or contemplative practice. You can form, but if you were to ask me which of the traditions is best suited for scientific research, I mentioned the three vehicles. Yeah, that would be a little hard to answer. But I would say that among the three vehicles, the Mahayana, the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, among the three, the Hinayana or Theravada practices of Southeast Asia are sensorially and strategically well suited to science, because science likes to break things down into components. And the early Buddhist tradition had something called the Abhidharma, which is very much based on analysis of systems into subsystems and so forth. And that general divide and conquer, untangle and be free approach that you find in Southeast Asia, I think works well with science, because in science, you also want to break things down into atoms, components, eigenvectors, fundamental dimensions, and so forth. So I would say any of the traditions are amenable, and they do have different distinguishing features. But in terms of sensory categories and the systematic nature of observing, probably the Southeast Asian practices are a little bit more natural for that kind of analysis.